Abundance.
Hey, this is Christopher Schreck.
And I'm Landon Metz. Welcome back to the Abundant Zine podcast.
Today we'll be speaking with Loney Abrams and Johnny Stanish, the artists behind Wretched Flowers, a collaborative project that merges flower arrangement, environmental conservation, and visual art into a single interwoven practice.
Working with materials ranging from foraged plants and handmade ceramics to digital media and 3D printed bioplastics, Loney and Johnny used Wretched Flowers to question and provide sustainable alternatives to harmful practices within the floral industry.
In this episode, we explore Loney and Johnny's long-standing artistic partnership, the complicated social history of foraging in America, and the aesthetic potential of invasive plant life.
Thanks for joining us. Hello.
Hi.
What's up?
Hey, Loney. Hey, Johnny.
Hi, guys. Nice to meet you.
Hey, guys.
How's it going?
Really good. Yourself?
Chilling. I'm at my studio in the city. Where are you guys? Are you in Connecticut?
Yeah, we're about 70-minute drive from Brooklyn north. So we're right on the border of New York and Connecticut near Danbury. Yeah, right now we're doing some construction in the main part of our house. So we're in weird areas. Johnny's in the basement. I'm in bed with a puppy and a cat.
Sounds great.
Yeah, they can join the conversation. Sure.
How did you guys end up in Connecticut? What's the story there?
It's kind of a crazy story, but basically we were in Brooklyn for the past 10, 11 years. We were finally like, you know what? We can get a house for a cheaper mortgage somewhere. We were looking in upstate New York. A couple of our bids went through. One of the places had mold in it and stuff like that. And so we kind of backed out. And then we realized over the border in Connecticut, property tax is cheaper. And so we just kind of went that route. And we needed to be within an hour or a little more over from the city. And we closed right when the pandemic hit the city. We were kind of part of the exodus, but we were already kind of leaving. It just so happened to be at the same time.
So you guys have actually been there for over a year?
2 years, yeah. Basically, we lucked out. Connecticut was the only state, apparently, to not fully recover from the 2008 crisis. So there was cheap real estate. I mean, relatively speaking, obviously. Yeah, this house we found had just been sitting here for a year. And we got it right before kind of all hell broke loose. So we're super grateful and lucky and fortunate to have gotten this place because, yeah, we had been, like Johnny said, just kind of hoping to get out of New York for a little while. We were just waiting for the right time. But you know how it is. I mean, once you have your studio rent plus your apartment rent, it's an expensive place to live.
Totally.
So yeah, greener pastures for sure. And I'm sure we'll get into it. But with our work too, it just kind of made sense to have land. We have 2 acres now. So we wanted some land. We wanted some space, some place to kind of spread out. It was random where we ended up. I think Johnny's first time in Connecticut was looking at the house.
Cool.
He had never been to Connecticut before. I had driven through it, but we knew nothing about the area. Still don't really know a whole lot, but yeah, kind of random, but it worked out.
Well, how has the move impacted your practice?
A lot. Well, a lot of changes happened when we moved. So like Johnny said, it was March 2020. So the whole world changed right when we moved. But also we basically were working multiple full-time jobs to make this sort of dream happen right up until we moved. So not only did we move house, we also left pretty toxic, awful full-time jobs that we hated and then just became full-time artists. And we also teach at Pratt. So it was a lot of transitions at once. But yeah, I mean, now we have, like I said, just more space. We have a full ceramic studio in our garage. We have a second studio with 3D printers and a screen printing lab studio. Yeah, we basically have 2 or 3 studios in our house. And then, like I said, plenty of land and space to go forage and things like that. And then just time. We're not working for the weekend to work more on the weekend, we're just kind of like, taking it easy a little bit, which feels really, really luxurious. But I think that's the way it probably should be.
Yeah.
How has that like time and space affected your work? Like, I'm sure that you have kind of like a new energy, no?
Definitely. I mean, at first it was really about just like finally kind of building out our dream studio, which, everyone knows you keep adapting your studio. But I think it helped us like be able to experiment a lot more. Our studio in Brooklyn was 300 square feet. Now we have, 600 plus square feet, plus another studio, plus all this land. So it just allowed us to not be like confined to like being dictated kind of by the space we were working in. And we've been able to like experiment more with like growing plants and things like that, which we weren't really able to do in Brooklyn as much.
Yeah. And has the relationship to foraging shifted or evolved or changed since you've moved? I mean, obviously, like the local flora is something very different.
Yeah. I mean, the reason this all kind of started was so NYC specific. It really started with us having a studio. Where was it? Like, I guess East New York?
Yeah, it was in East New York. Yeah. We had a shed in our backyard too that we used, but yeah.
Yeah. But just around that area, there was a lot of parking lots and warehouses and sidewalks that were just kind of neglected and not really kept up. And so a lot of weeds were growing around our studio. And we kind of like, we're waiting for resin to dry, walking around being like, wait, what? Like, this just grows here? Like, no one planted this? Like, totally just kind of amazed by the biodiversity that we were finding in, the so-called concrete jungle, and just being like, literally, how did this get here? Like, how did this one plant migrate from wherever in the globe it had been to this spot? And we kind of just started asking questions and looking things up. And that's kind of how Wretched Flowers basically started. And that was such a big part of it, and really kind of celebrating the natural world that does allow itself to grow in New York. And that kind of like resilience is inspiring, and it's cool, and it's fun to look at, and it's interesting to research. So by coming out here, it's like, of course, we have so much more access to plants and foraging, and it's in some ways a lot easier. But in other ways, there was something kind of magical about doing it in New York. Like here, it just kind of feels like you're being the rural person you're supposed to be. Whereas in New York, you felt like you were like doing something bad. Even though, picking flowers is the most wholesome thing you can do, it is against the law. And so we almost felt like maybe how like a street artist would feel, or, somebody who's just like still making art and doing whatever, but kind of having to like creep around, like do stuff at night, watch your back.
Yeah. At one of the parks, we got in trouble. We always use the excuse like, oh, it's a school art project. It's for school. And they basically turn a blind eye. So there was a few times where, we got approached and we're like, you shouldn't be doing this. And that kind of like led to more research about foraging laws and things like that. So yeah, I think like Loney said, there was more of a kind of guerrilla attitude, where around here, a lot of places we forage are either on our property or there's this hunting place called Cranberry Mountain in New York, and there'll just be people hunting birds, and then we'll be foraging, and the hunters are always like, oh, you guys are cleaning up the weeds for us to be able to see birds better. So it's just a way different attitude here.
Yeah. Are there different foraging laws in Connecticut versus New York, or just like in a rural environment versus an urban environment?
There's not, but like there's also like no cops here.
Right.
It's just a different thing. I mean, I don't think people are getting arrested for foraging like anywhere, probably. Well, that's not true. I mean, I think it's like anything else. It's kind of up to law enforcement discretion on who they target and what they will crack down on, etc. But I mean, unsurprisingly, it has a very racist history tied to basically like the end of slavery and trying to, should I get into it? You didn't ask this question, but
yeah, we were going to ask you about this.
Okay, cool. Basically, once slavery ended and slaves were freed, a lot of people left the farms that they were working on and would forage or hunt and then sell what they could find in order to make a living. And basically slave owners were like, wait, now I don't have anyone to work on my farms. Like no one wants to work. We're familiar with this phrase now, but like no one wants to work. So basically laws were passed that made foraging illegal, and it made it very hard for freed slaves to make a living. And many were forced back onto the farms that they had been enslaved on, now as like indentured servants or like workers, but not really. So it's kind of been just left over from this law that was essentially just a way to encroach on the rights of like free slaves. And it continues.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to have served kind of a dual function where it is marginalizing certain communities, but it also is reinforcing certain notions of private property.
Exactly.
You know, you guys are really generous in the way that you share your research online. And I think the series that you did about anti-foraging laws, the 3-part series, was really like eye-opening for me. But the flip side of that is the kind of the third portion. You spoke to why, in light of this history, foraging might also remain not just a beneficial practice, but even a subversive one. And I wonder if you think along those lines in what you're doing now.
Well, there's a couple parts to it. And the first part has to do with what's the alternative? Like, at least with food, everyone has to eat, right? So either you're supporting big ag system that may be problematic, or you're foraging, which, you know, never uses pesticides or herbicides, it's local, all those things. And then there's also the other side of it, which is like, how does the actual environment react? So there's a lot of different ways you can go about foraging. For us, since we're not foraging for sustenance, it's not like we have to get certain things. So what we focus on is things that would actually improve the little micro ecosystem that we're in if they were removed. So we look at like invasive species that need to be or could be pulled out, species that are harmful to the other species that are there. Or if we're cutting native species, we're looking for things that have already reproduced. So they're like seed pods and things like that. So yeah, so that's sort of, and in that way, like we are hoping to kind of, you know, we love flowers, we love floristry, we want to engage in this kind of art form, but we also are just not comfortable sourcing flowers that are grown, you know, in Colombia with tons of toxins and pesticides and flown on jets to Miami, which then need to be packed in refrigerated trucks and then, you know, shipped all over the country, again, fully refrigerated. I mean, it has a huge carbon footprint like anything else, like the food we eat and everything else. So that's kind of, for us, foraging was a solution or an alternative to engaging in a system that we weren't really comfortable with.
Right. Really, what happened is we were exploring around the Chelsea flower market. It kind of just made us think like, oh, wait, where is all this coming from? Because we weren't florists by trade. We kind of just, like Loney said, literally like stumbled into it, exploring around the city. And that was what kind of like led us to start researching about the flower industry and all those type of problems Loney was talking about. So really, it was like exploring around the Chelsea flower market and really just being like, wait, what is going on? Where is all this coming from? Daily, refrigerated. And that's kind of like part of like our subversion. We're like, oh, maybe we should just start foraging as well and like pay homage to the things around the city that like are kind of neglected and overlooked.
I was gonna say, because you mentioned, earlier invasive species. I feel like even the name Wretched Flowers seems designed to challenge and maybe even invert, certain conventional notions of imperfection and desirability. And I'm wondering if that might be a good way for us to get into kind of what Wretched Flowers is for people who maybe aren't familiar with the project, and how, the idea of deformity, decay, ecosystems, how this all fits into the concept of the project.
So Wretched Flowers is basically the name that the two of us use to describe an ongoing project that includes a lot of different things. It includes foraging and research into ethnobotany and making content for Instagram and digital media that's about that research and about looking at what the relationship is between plants and people and society and culture. But out of that, we create a lot of things. We have an e-commerce website. So we sell a lot of dried arrangements. We make ceramics. We make like kind of homeware type stuff in addition to like one-off artworks. That kind of is more of like the gallery world. And then we also do events. We do like art direction for events or happenings or dinners or that kind of thing. So yeah, we have a lot of different ways of kind of expressing our interests. But at the heart of it is this idea in the conversation of art and art history. When we talk about beauty, this is something that we associate with like romanticism. Like this is an old conversation, right? Like if we're talking about art and it's beautiful, like we can still use the terms beautiful and we know what that means, but it's kind of like an outdated conversation at this point in art history. With floristry, not so much. we're still just like obsessed with beauty and freshness. And like a beautiful flower means a flower that has been unbruised, untouched, very youthful at the height of its reproductive moment. There's not too much wiggle room when it comes to beauty and floristry. And so what we were hoping to do was to really look at like the whole life cycle of each plant, not just that one single moment of like distilled beauty, and really look at like, okay, maybe beyond just beauty, maybe something to celebrate and recognize is like the end of a plant's life cycle when it's a seed pod, and like maybe it's gray and maybe it's decrepit and maybe it has holes all over it where beetles have been munching on it, but that's what makes it cool. Like it fed those beetles. That's awesome. It's just kind of like trying to find other ways of presenting floristry and bouquets beyond just like, you know, your typical beautiful flower arrangement.
So you established Wretched Flowers in 2019, is that right?
Yeah, in the summer of 2019.
But you guys have been collaborating artistically for a number of years prior to that, and I gather that you two are married as well.
Yeah.
Which I didn't realize until this call. So how did you first meet then? Was it at Pratt? Because I know you teach there, but you guys also went there for undergraduate, right?
Yeah, we met at Pratt. We were doing our MFA from 2011 to 2013. We were just kind of in the same studio together, always around, hanging out. We were like best friends for like 2 years, like really, really close. And then right before we were about to graduate, we started this project called Hotel Art, kind of collaborating as curators with that. And then it kind of like struck me one day. I was like, oh no, I'm like in love with my best friend. And I was like a little worried.
Wait, okay. What was that moment? Please tell me what that moment was.
Honestly, it's so like cheesy, but I was just like sitting there. I can't, it's been so long, I can't really remember, but I just remember like sitting there and it just like clicked. I was like, oh my God, like Loney is the exact person I've been always looking for without having to look. She's always been there. We get along real well. She's super smart. I love her work. You know, it just checked all the boxes. You know, when you're really close to someone, you can't really tell what flirting and what just like casually having a relationship is. So I didn't really know like what her vibes were. I can't remember. I saw her and her friend kind of snickering one day. We were at Lone Wolf, or we were at some bar or something, and then I got the vibe. I was like, oh, maybe she's feeling this too, and it just kind of like. And then here's what happened. She got bed bugs.
Oh my God, I'm like blushing so hard right now. I'm like hot.
She got bed bugs and called me. And it was like, I answered, it's like 3 a.m. or whatever. And she's like, I have bed bugs. Can I come stay the night? And I was like, of course. And, you know, that was kind of struck off the romantic kind of situation. So bed bugs brought us together, I think.
Oh my God. A blessing in disguise.
Yeah, right? Little did you know that was like my pickup line.
Right.
I didn't really have bed bugs. I did that all the time. No, just kidding. That would have been messed up.
And Loney, how about you? Like, was that night really the night that it clicked for you, or did you have something brewing before?
No, I definitely had a crush. I don't really know a specific moment, but yeah, I mean, I think just through Hotel Art, like we would go on these really fun adventures. Like we would be like, let's find some weird spooky hotel upstate that we can do a show at, or like, let's go to the beach and do some weird photo shoot. And so Johnny was just always up for like doing these weird little adventures with me, and ended up being these like cute little romantic like weekend getaways, you know, with my collaborator. And so eventually it just became obvious that we were doing this partially because of Hotel Art, because we were excited about it, and partially I think just because we enjoyed spending time with each other and wanted to like go hang out in a hotel room, basically. I don't know why I get so I'm like blushing so hard. It's just so cute. It's so cute to like hear him talk about it at the very beginning like that. But yeah, we were always collaborators ever before we were dating or anything like that. So our entire relationship has really been like really intertwined with our collaborative artistic journey, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. I mean, and what makes the collaboration work? I mean, is it about like shared sensibilities where you're thinking in similar terms, or is it more that one person's vision and skills complements the others?
With Hotel Art, we were curating, so it was a little bit easier. That was kind of like a taste gauge, right? But when we started actually making work together, it took us several years to like figure out our visual language and like what we were talking about. We failed a lot and kind of made a lot of bad art for a few years. I think that like taught us how to work together, who has strengths in what realm that we're working in. So it just took us a little bit to understand each other's working process, who's better at what. And then like we were doing just a project that we were calling There, which was just more of a contemporary art kind of practice. We were having fun doing it and we were having shows and stuff, but it just wasn't really, we weren't even able to buy our own work if it was at the gallery. So we were just like, this is just sort of unfair. Like no one's able to even like enjoy this stuff unless you have X amount of money. And so that kind of like made us also switch into a different kind of format that was more accessible for more people to be able to like participate in and, you know, only have to have $50 to buy a little Wretched vase or something instead of 4,000 plus to buy a wall work.
I think you said it. Like we definitely start very kind of 50-50 with any idea, just like bouncing ideas back and forth. And then there is a division of labor that ends up happening as a project continues, just based on like what we each like to do and are good at. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine at this point doing things separately because it's like most of what we talk about and think about and do is like the work. So like it's hard for me to imagine not constantly hearing about somebody else's thought process and work and not wanting to like participate in that or collaborate somehow.
So you mentioned hotel art where, you know, for listeners who aren't familiar, you were installing guerrilla exhibitions in hotel rooms and then presenting the documentation after the fact at other venues. There was a conversation about what's the work, what's the venue. But there was also, which I was really personally interested in, was this joint show that you two did in 2016 at the Knockdown Center, which to me, in retrospect, seemed to introduce a number of ideas that you're currently exploring with Wretched. I think on a literal level, I could maybe point to the birdseed sculptures that were built from molds, where you're actively inviting birds to help transform the pieces, encouraging interspecies cooperation. But more broadly, there's also this clear intentionality with your choice of materials where you're selecting your ingredients in order to highlight, and I would say question, the economics and the systemic practices behind them. That seems to be very true of Wretched as well. So I guess I'm wondering, when you established Wretched, did you see it as an extension of ongoing themes in your work, or did you see it more as kind of a separate venture that was informed to some degree by your training and perspective as artists?
It's interesting you note that specific show in 2016 at the Knockdown Center, because that was like really when we finally kind of figured out our visual language together, that show specifically. I mean, I'll let Loney kind of go into more of it, but I appreciate that you've noticed that because we did too. I think it kind of came into its own. We kind of, like I said, had our own practices going on, and I had never really like taken collaboration serious. It's funny because we co-teach at Pratt. We've been co-teaching there for 5+ years. It's really hard to teach collaboration. We always try to tell the students, you know, it's kind of a learned endeavor. You can't really like force collaboration on someone. I think that's kind of like why our collaboration like works out so well, is because it just kind of like naturally happened and it wasn't like a forced thing. We just realized like, oh, we both have similar interests. Oh, we both have certain skills in certain areas. Let's try to like have two lives lead one in a kind of sort of way, you know. And of course there's always some push and shove, but that's okay with any sort of collaboration.
Yeah. I think that when we first started Wretched, we saw it as like a complete departure and a separate thing. And we weren't necessarily making any sort of decision of like, okay, we're stopping this and starting this. And it was just kind of like, let's see where this goes. But I think the more we go, the more clear it is how connected it all is. It's the same ideas and same concepts that we were always interested in, but Wretched Flowers, I think we're more interested in looking at not just the content, not just the subject matter, but the model that we're working within, and looking at like, how can we think about, rather than, as Johnny mentioned, like art objects that really only work in the context of a gallery system and collectorship and all that mess, how can we make additions, or how can we think about like merch being something that we make and are proud of, and like not having merch be a dirty word. So in some ways, like Wretched is more of just like a different model, and that's what makes it really different. But subject matter wise, I mean, that show was really what it boils down to is like the form of something versus its material makeup, and how the material makeup of something is inherently political and interconnected with everything, basically. So like looking at one example that we always sort of talk about is like you might see two loaves of bread, right, that look exactly the same. They're the same shape, they're the same color, they're in the same type of bag. But if you look in the ingredients, you can tell, this one has like flour, water, yeast, whatever. And that signifies a very specific kind of production method versus one that is like, 50 ingredients that you can't pronounce. And that is indicative of a completely different global supply network. And in the same way with like, you're looking at a carnation or whatever flower, two flowers might look identical, but one was grown in our backyard and one was shipped from Colombia. So we're kind of drawing attention to like trying to look at beyond just what things look like, but what they're made out of and what that says about kind of the world that we live in, this capitalistic world that we live in. I think Wretched in some way was like, okay, we kind of talk about production a lot. We kind of talk about companies and brands and policies and all these things a lot. But like, what if we actually just tried to model what we think a company should be? What would that look like in our eyes to actually say, like, we're not just artists, we're also like business people and like brand people and like whatever that is, and try to figure out what that might look like. Looking back, it was a very natural progression, but I think at the time we were too close to it. We didn't really see it that way.
It's interesting hearing you both speak about this because I feel there is this sort of tendency to have like a macro lens as far as the sort of positioning of the output, but it also in a very beautiful and poetic way reminds me of the description of a flower that you were speaking about, Loney, where it's like, it's not just this one particular moment in the life cycle of the flower. It's kind of zooming out and taking the time to look at the subtleties of how this particular moment is situated within the overall life cycle of the plant and of the flower and how that fits into the ecosystem. And there's a very thoughtful approach to, I guess just to a way of looking at like an ecological notion of, honestly, frankly, it seems like everything. I think you both have a tendency to have a very zoomed out and interconnected approach, whether that's the way you're looking at the way plants are situated in their environment or the way art and artists are situated within their careers or within their contexts or communities.
That's so interesting. That's a really interesting observation. That's cool that you think that. I like that. I mean, maybe that's partially, I think, why we're drawn to ecology. I mean, in undergrad, I didn't study art. I studied ecology and sociology. It's basically just looking at systems. And that kind of science really allows you to kind of think, like you said, like the macro or like the zoomed out, which can be really helpful, I think, when looking at relationships and how basically the world works. But that's interesting. I hadn't really made that connection so literally. And I think with like the subject matter, Johnny grew up on a ranch in like very rural Montana. I grew up in a city. So my kind of like entryway into the world of ecology and nature was like an academic one mostly. And Johnny's was much more an experiential, like childhood one. And I think that kind of continues into this collaboration where Johnny's a lot more hands-on and experiential in the way that he works and contributes to the project. And I am much more kind of like heady or like academic. Not that we both don't also just enjoy like the outdoors. I mean, especially now that we have this pup, we're like going on hikes every day and where we live is like beautiful. We could do that easily. But yeah, I think that we both had an interest in the subject, but from very different viewpoints, and they've kind of carried through. Have you guys ever collaborated? Do you work collaboratively at all? I mean, you're collaborating right now with this podcast.
Chris and I, we have a pretty long relationship of collaborating, I would say, no?
Yeah. The collaboration can take a lot of different forms. I think the discussions that he and I have had in the studio, I would consider collaborative to a certain degree.
Definitely.
The way that he and I have approached the essays that I've written about his work have been collaborative to some degree. It's just about exchange, and it's about ideas being realized through different venues, is how I think about it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. I will say, something that I appreciate about the way that you two have put across your ideas, and as I mentioned earlier, being very generous with your kind of research, is that even in being critical of certain systems and even in reinforcing notions of, consumer responsibility and personal choice, it's not about being prescriptive or kind of laying out a guilt trip. It seems like it's much more about speaking to simple awareness and then offering different options in terms of behaving intentionally. I wonder, first of all, how, if you agree with that, how conscious a decision or effort that is on your part. And B, I'd also be curious to know how your work with Wretched as it's gone on has maybe had a similar effect for you, how it's expanded your perspective.
I really don't want to be prescriptive at all when it comes to like consumer choice. And sometimes it's just really hard not to. Like, when we see 100,000 roses being delivered to like the Kardashians and people talking about how beautiful it is. Of course, it's like hard not to want to get like blamey for that. And this is something we were exploring too at that 2016 show, is like just the frustration with the burden that consumers have to act ethically and responsibly. Like, it is the responsibility of corporations and the government to make sure that we are safe and protected and that nobody is being exploited. Nature isn't being extracted to the point where it's no longer sustainable. Like, that is not any consumer's responsibility. Like, any type of advocacy that I hope to get across is much less pointed towards the consumer or our customer and more so just pointed towards the people who actually have power, which is not our customers, really. We try to be clear about that, but I also think that a lot of the response that we've gotten from people is like, whoa, I never thought about flowers this way. I never thought about my bodega flowers being covered in pesticides, like when I stuck my entire face into them and took a big whiff. So I think it's great that people are able to take away from that. And if they end up making choices based on this new knowledge, that's awesome. But again, it's hard because in the end, like, often our arrangements, they're definitely more expensive than like your bodega flowers or your Trader Joe flowers. And I don't expect anyone to choose ours over any others purely based on like principle. So yeah, we try to be really kind of gentle about that. I don't know that we're always successful in that. We might come across sometimes as a little preachy almost, but it is more about, I think, like you said, just criticizing the systems that are in place that make it really, really hard for consumers to make good choices.
I have one kind of like non sequitur question for you. Do either of you find you need time solo to recharge? And do you have like autonomous respective practices that you like to keep private for yourselves?
It's funny you say that because only recently has that kind of been a talk among Loney and I. Sometimes you do kind of need to have your own thing, and like my own thing, I hate to even say this, but I make music, but just like no one hears it. Only me and Loney hear it. Maybe a few friends, but it's very for me. It's very like therapy based, and I'm terrible at it, but I've been doing it. I love it, right? And Loney kind of has her own little stuff.
Yeah, I've been making music for my whole life too, and no one's ever heard it. And it will always be that way. Yeah, it's really nice to have a creative outlet that not only isn't collaborative, but isn't for anybody else. Because I think we both kind of hit a wall at some point. Or, there's different points in, I think, any artist's career when they really grapple with like, once they really have an audience and they have demand and they have a style, it can feel limiting sometimes, right? Like, not even limiting. It's like sometimes your brain just gets rewired in this way where you're like, I don't know whether I'm thinking through my own eyes or this internalized perspective of everybody else.
You become a machine in a way.
You do, yeah. It's really hard. Like, I really started practicing, like, when I would finish something, like really looking at it and judging, or not judging, but like reflecting on my thoughts, whether they were coming like from my real own sense of satisfaction or disappointment, or, oh, like, will this do well? Will people like this? Like, what kind of content is this going to make? Like, how are we going to shoot this for the website? That kind of thing. And it does affect how you work. even if you're super aware of it, or even if you try to resist it. So I think it's important to have, for me at least, like a creative outlet that I've set this rule for myself where like no one's ever going to hear it. So I never, ever have to have that kind of thought process. I never have to think like, is this likable? Like, what will people think of this? It's purely just like, it's fun. So I do it.
The Abundant Scene podcast is produced by Ryan Leahy. Our theme music is by Casper Bjork.
You can read and listen to all of our conversations at abundancezine.com. Follow us on Instagram at AbundanceZine, and be sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for listening.